Welcome to MFP Live. I'm Donna Ladd, the editor and co-founder of Mississippi Free Press. And here, as always, my co-host, the publisher and co-founder of the Mississippi Free Press, Kimberly Griffin. Hey, Kimberly. And
hello.
Hello. Donna, it's been years since I've seen you.
I know. I'm just tickled. And I haven't seen David Jr. face to face in quite a while either. So we're going to talk about that. So y'all, this is kind of like a reunion, as those out there can tell, two just remarkable Mississippi men, or I consider both of you Mississippi men. I think Mississippi adopted David Sr. for sure. Whether or not they wanted to in the first place is another subject. But let me introduce y'all first, and we can get into that. So David Dennis Sr. grew up in a sharecropper family in rural Louisiana, went to college, and eventually became a lawyer. He joined the civil rights movement in college. He led lunch counter sit-ins and fighting to integrate interstate buses and terminals as an early member of the Freedom Riders. He was also a key top person in Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, and has spent, we've known him a long time here in Mississippi because of the work that he has done, and just being a remarkable all-around person here. His son, David Dennis Jr., is a senior writer at Anscape and an American Mosaic Journalism Prize recipient. His book, The Movement Made Us, will be released in 2022. It's actually just been released, I believe. David is a graduate of Murrah High School here in Jackson, where he grew up, and of Davidson College. And he may or may not have written a hip hop column for my newspaper here at Jackson Free Press when he was a teenager. So that he may or may not confirm that. So welcome, gentlemen. We're tickled to have you both here tonight.
It's good to be here.
Yeah, it's great being here. It's it's a full circle type of thing. Of one of my first, or maybe my actual very first bylines were at the Jackson Free Press. So it's cool being back.
I think you were like 14 or something, right?
Maybe. I was in college writing.
Oh, were you? Okay.
I had a hip hop column back in college when I was trying to get things started. So
I think I just conflated your age with our reporter Nick Jr.
I was thinking that he was 14.
Columns. So sorry about that.
Right.
But yeah, so it's
it makes me sound better if I was 14, like I knew what I was doing back then. So we can go with it.
That's right. And when I've seen, I don't know, I don't even know how I first met David Sr. here, but we have known each other for a long time, even though, as you were saying, we haven't been face to face in a while. But we're so happy to have you guys here to talk about whatever you want to talk about. But this kind of remarkable book here, The Movement Made Us, which has actually been released now, right, David?
Yes, May 10th, last Tuesday. Yeah.
Right. And it's let me just say this. I've read a lot of books about the civil rights movement and by people who were there, a lot of remarkable books. I think a lot of us have. Still, this book for me just stood out in ways. I love the cross-generational piece of it, and the honesty of not just the realities of what was happening out there on the front lines of the movement, but also the difficulty of that on families, and the fear and the complications. It's just it's a very honest memoir and book, and that chronicles such an important time in American history. So I really recommend it to everyone. And I just want to get that out before we get into the conversation, how good this book really is. So David Jr., tell us, just, you kind of write in the book, I think about why and how you decided to do this and do it with your father. But I would love you to just kind of set that table for the people who haven't read the book yet? You know, why you did this book and why you did it now.
Yeah, I mean, I sort of always wanted to write my dad's stories. I'd sat around the table I remember when we first moved to Jackson when I was 6, and a lot of these veterans would just come and hang out. Hollis Watkins, Dr. Anderson would be there. Jughead, he'd be there, like all these folks that knew, and they would just tell these really fascinating episodic stories. And I was always just, just captivated by him. And so as I started thinking about being a writer, I was thinking about, I want to write these stories and tell them. And so, but I didn't want to do a biography. And as a kid, I sort of only thought of biographies and couldn't really quite figure out the format that I wanted. And then when I was at Murrah, my teacher at Murrah, Ms. Williams, was Alex Davis Williams. She introduced me to a book called The Things They Carried, which is sort of short serialized stories about Vietnam. And I thought, well, I want to write these. I think I could write them like this about Dad's time in the movement, and not, really thinking about my place in it or us having a conversation, just really thinking about Dad and his stories. And there was always in the back of my mind. And, as my career started to, be getting a little okay, I started thinking more about it. And also it was during the Trump years and Black Lives Matter, and it felt more urgent in that time to let's really, really get these stories done. Let's put them on paper and let's try to tell them, because I think it's a poignant time to be doing that. And, we started really working in earnest in about 2018, getting these stories recorded and, written down. And we got our deal at September 2019. Has been just writing ever since.
Yeah, I read this and I was dazzled, but I'm also, because I'm a Black daughter, so I thought it's scary. You do to ask your parents things, and it's complicated when you talk to them about Black trauma, and you're like, I mean, you all had set the table because there were these conversations around the table, but to have that one-on-one conversation, I was a little nervous. I was like, oh, I turned the page and go, oh, what was that like for you as a son? I think you had a leg up on the rest of us because you, like I said, you had set the table.
Yeah, I mean, it was revelatory. I mean, it helped. I helped. I knew my dad a lot better in these stories. I understood him better. I understood what he and his friends went through a lot better. But there were hard times where I had to ask him really, really tough questions and really prod him for what were his emotional reactions to things. What was he going through at the time? So it was, there were times where it was scary, where it was like, he's going to, say, I don't know how much I'm a push or how, traumatizing this is going to be, or if he's going to go into sort of a, bad place with it or things like that. So it was, the way you felt reading it was the way I felt hearing the stories and thinking about asking the questions and things like that. Like you just sort of didn't know what was going to happen on the next page. And, thankfully, Dad was, graceful with his time and was patient with me, and we were able to get through it. But it was, and on the other side of it, we ended up in a much better place. And now that the book is out and we've done some of these events, we did a couple events in Jackson this week, and just seeing people and their reactions to it, and Dad's peers, and like being around them. I mean, it's a worthwhile experience.
Mr. Dennis, I was reading this, and they called my dad Sonny, so that made me happy when I saw that. That made me happy. You talk about making, because I want to start at the beginning. I always like the beginning. You talk about making the decision when you had to ride on that Pepsi. Was it a Pepsi truck or a Coke truck for a day?
I think it was a Pepsi.
Yeah.
We had to really figure that out. I remember they had these big cup drinks on it too, so I was a little confused about what the name of the truck. I think it was Pepsi. It was not a Coca-Cola truck.
Yeah, okay.
I know that.
It was a, yeah. I think at the end you finally, because you guys have I think you guys have galleys of the book and not the final. So that was, remember, we talk about memories in the book, and memories were coming to Dad at the very end, and so we were very close to the end of it. That it was a knee-high truck.
Knee-high, that's right. Knee-high.
Yeah, and he
had a knee-high truck.
Oh, yeah.
And I did have to tell him, if you remember something else different, just don't tell me, because we got this book. But we did sneak the knee-high thing in there in the book.
Yeah.
So you talk about spending time with your neighbor who was doing well, kind of was his own boss, thought a lot of you, wasn't impressed with your letter from Dillard too much. And you talk about that day and how you went on the ride and you came back and your mother had been lovingly, as mothers would do, putting the letter back on the table, putting the letter from Dillard University back on the table. Talk about what that day was like and how it encouraged you to go to Dillard.
Yeah, well, you have to really see where I was living. All right. So I was born on the plantation, right? We got that in. And so then we moved to the city, what you want to call it, the city, with my grandparents in Cedar Grove. And then from there to a place called Hollywood. Can you believe it? And so there are these apartments. They were like made out of cinder blocks. They were like shotgun, all right? But you know what shotgun means is you can stand in the front door and shoot a shotgun and go straight through it and hit nobody. Not a wall either. So Mr. Jack and Miss Murdis live right next door to us in another cinder block place. And believe it or not, those two buildings are still there in the same spot. And so we were very close neighbors. I mean, somebody yell on the other side, you can hear it, even though you got the cinder block pieces there. And so we were very close, family-wise and everything else. So Mr. Jack had this truck, but when you say he was well off, you think about what that means. He had a job and he had some money coming in as retirement, but well off is that he was living in the same kind of cinder block place as we were. Right. And no children, just the two of them there.
Right.
And so the other piece of that is I was the first one in my family to graduate from high school. So graduation from high school was a big thing. I mean, just like you made it, And so Mr. Jack felt that way, and everything. I don't know if my mom really felt that way or what that was, But being out of high school, you got a chance to get a better job, that kind of stuff. So his thing was he was getting ready to retire to deal with his route, And so to me, I was almost convinced that's all there was for me because of where I live and the way things were. Although my mother has scraped, to the bottom and really made a tremendous sacrifice to send me to a boarding school, to get me out of the streets, and stuff is.
Wow.
And so I went to a place called Holy Rose Institute in Lafayette, Louisiana. And then my last year, things didn't work out there. It was too expensive. So my mom sent me to live with my aunt in Baton Rouge. And, I went to graduate from Southern Lab School, Southern High. So I was still every summer up home and everything else. But before that, going to high school, I grew up with this group of people, in the neighborhood there, Mr. Jack and Miss Murdis and others and stuff. And so the idea was that, to me too, was this must be it, until I went on this truck. And so that was the experience, Mr. Jack was very happy but all those years I knew about him, sweating and working hard. What he had to show me that day was, this is what you're going to get. This route can be yours. So he worked a lot in the black areas and stores and stuff like that and it's very significant in this book is because Black people own little grocery stores and stuff like that at service stations and their own little businesses. And so that's what he did most of the services in terms of his knee-high route, These are like big cup drinks that you got for a nickel, and stuff is. And so my half day to try to work with that just in my head, I had to say, like, it's got to be something better than this. Because at the end of the day, he kept talking about this gold watch he had. He kept showing me this gold watches. And so in my head was going, is this it? this is where I am. This is, and so at 12 noon, we stop for lunches. It just hit me, bam, I can't do this. And I think Mr. Jack told me, I just can't do this. And I told my mama had made me some bologna sandwiches and stuff and so I gave Mr. Jack my sandwich. And I told him, whatever I made, he can have. And I apologize, but I can't do this. And I went walking home. When I got home, I told my Mom, where are those letters from Dillard and Grambling? I think it was Grambling. The other was. And she said, here they are, And that's how I accepted a scholarship at Dillard University at that time. But the idea there is what happens to young Black men was very, later on I began to understand, I was really at a crossroad, just one decision, and I could have been working Mr. Jack's route until I died. So, but he was a good man, and, and he worked hard. He was a good man. He provided for his family, but that was it for him. That was his role. But for him, that was good. So his thing was, it just so happens is about a few weeks ago, we were someplace, and my son, David, gave me a watch. And I just couldn't help but hit him with it. I said, okay. I finally made what Mr. Jack was.
Oh.
It didn't mean the same as, but that's a very significant piece because it really began to reshape my life, and take direction. So, and what this is all about too has to do with how much of my life, was really balanced around fate, and things just happen. And by luck, by accident, I'm still here, or I did what I did. It wasn't because it was pre-planned.
And when you got to Dillard, you were focused on being in school. You were not focused on any of that civil rights stuff. But there was a lady that tell us about, because my mother went to school and she was afraid to tell my grandfather she was protesting. I don't know if she ever told him until she was 30 or something. Because, they sent you to school to go to school, right?
Right. Well,
so tell us about that transition.
Yeah. Well, a little bit before that, how deep it was for me in this whole containing this thing about fate. So graduating from Southern Lab School, I was a senior at Southern Lab School when Southern University did its second major march. It was the second largest march of students in the United States. And the guy who was leading that march, his name was Ed Brown. And so my best friend was in school, was his brother. His name was Hubert Brown. And so we were both standing outside as they marched by because they were getting ready to close the school down. And he kept telling, come on, come on, come on, come on. And we both said, no, no, no. So we went by Hubert's house and played basketball. But to show how close that was is Hubert later on became known as H. Rap Brown, was my best friend and classmate. And neither one of us was into this whole movement piece. So when I go to Dillard University, there's students at Dillard who have been arrested from Dillard, Southern University of New Orleans, University of New Orleans. There was the Xavier University. Xavier, there was Rudy Lombard at Dillard. That was I've forgotten his name now, but was there is. And then from SUNO, Southern University of New Orleans, there was Aretha Castle, which becomes very significant in this, is later on, who was head of the core group in New Orleans. So I got there, that was his thing, the people were up because all these kids are jail, but I didn't want to have anything to do with it. So later, I was walking across campus one day, and so they had this group of students under the flagpole at Dillard. And there was a young lady standing up on the stoop there, and she was talking to me about civil rights and stuff. And I stopped for a moment. I said, I kept moving. And then something hit me, and I stopped, and I said, oh, let me go back in, because she was a very attractive woman. So I really went back, not very interested in what she was saying, but only in what she was, how she looked. I wanted to try to get a date. And so that's what I did. She ended up talking to me about going to a meeting with her. And so I ended up at a meeting at Mount Zion, New Zion Baptist Churches. The minister was Reverend A.L. Davis, which turned out to be the church whereby the incorporation of SCLC, which I didn't know at the time, is a couple of years before that. And so that's where I ended up, is in terms of when I talk about this whole faith piece, and met these great people who really had made a difference in my life. And to make it more significant, that this civil rights leader who became an icon in New Orleans, her name was Aretha Castle. There's a street is named after, and Doris was her sister. So so that tells you how fate sort of takes the places. Because and then I even was not into the movement from my heart. I was in the movement of participating, going to meetings. That's all I was doing in the beginning. Was going to meetings, is trying to impress Doris and trying to get a date, with her. That was that. So I was really chasing my introduction to the civil rights movement.
Mr. Dennis, that's a good segue into something I wanted to talk about. And to David, it's like the way that women are so represented in this book, I think is, obviously true, but just the way that, they are so often front and center and very strong, and the women organizing in New Orleans, and to read their stories is very powerful, and the strength that they were showing in the movement, because it's often been talked about that the women of the civil rights movement weren't always getting the due that they deserve. They're not always household names. And so that's something that really impressed me, just kind of feeling those stories, and I think I would say to David, and maybe I'll make the question to you, just talk about that a little bit more, actually. What you discovered and the decisions that maybe you had to make as a writer about the stories to include, and, and kind of the role that these strong women played in all of that.
Yeah, that was probably the primary concern of mine going into the book, was that, this is me and Dad and our story and our relationship, and it's centered on Dad. And I was like, well, how can I make sure that we also feature a lot of these powerful Black women who are central to the movement? And I went into it thinking about, let's make sure this happens. Let's make sure they're featured, things like that. And I was really sort of worrying for nothing, because you can't tell the story without including them. I did not have to, I don't want people to think that I was intentional about making sure that Doris Castle, Aretha Castle, Maddie Bivens, Mrs. Hamer, of course, Victoria Gray, Anne Devine, Ms. Lennon Woods, all these, and way more, all these, powerful Black women were featured in the book. But I was intentional about it, but it wasn't something that I had to go out of my way to do. I wasn't, finding spaces for them to be included in the book, because you can't tell the story without centering these Black women, because they were the center of the movement. Everywhere we go, almost in every chapter of the book, there are Black women who are making sure that the movement continues. The movement's going. They're pushing people. They're pushing Dad. As you saw in the beginning, there's a reason Doris Castle is the first person you see in the book. Even before you really see Dad in the book. That's what the movement was about. And so it ended up being just extremely easy to do, because anything else is erasure. Any other book where we don't include these women is erasing them. Instead of, so I didn't really think of myself as including them. I thought of myself as telling a true story, and to do something else would be erasing them and not telling the truth. Right.
And I should mention for the people watching this, is that you have a very strong mother, and we all know, who has done, remarkable work that just, that we are aware of around the education, particularly here in Jackson.
Yeah, so Carolyn Jolivet, I think she's probably watching out there.
Yeah, so hey, Carolyn. Yeah. But
she was, and that's why, that's, a central reason why I'm making sure that I want them included in these books, or that I paying attention to their inclusion, make sure that's part of it for sure.
Right. And then to Mr. Dennis, talking about the women in the book kind of reminds me of the story of your the stories that you were telling about your grandmother, and also, and I think around your mother and some of the things that you learned that she had been doing quietly, that you didn't initially know about. But I must say, your grandmother and her car that you used, everything about your grandmother in this book was really remarkable. But and that was that in Shreveport? Am I right about that?
That's
right.
correct.
Yeah. So talk a little bit more about those women and the strength that you were kind of discovering through them.
Yeah, well, number one is that when I got involved in the civil rights movement, and I went back home to Shreveport, being an activist, they were always there and had my back. They never tried to discourage me. They never, really said, don't do this, anything like this. It was all about being careful, and pray and being in the hands of the Lord, the kind of thing is. And so, but their involvement, my mother's involvement, to the extent she was, I had no idea until after her death, when I found stuff in the trunk and everything else and going through stuff. But I should have caught it when she told me to go see Dr. Simpkins, who was a dentist, which is involved. And she said, when I came back, trying to figure out what to do and everything else, I let her know that was not going to work right now, because I had to do this thing in the movement. And she just looked at me and told me, you need to get your teeth clean. And I'm like, what? And she said, go get your teeth clean. Go Dr. Simpkins, and get your teeth clean. And so I go there, and Dr. Simpkins, C.L. Simpkins Shreveport, was an iconic civil rights leader. He's one of the founders of SCLC. He's on the original board. He knew Dr. King, Ella Baker personally, and everything else is. But I didn't know all this at this time. And so I go in his office, and he's there, and he says, hey, son, I've been waiting for you to talk to you. And he goes, he immediately, nothing about teeth at all. So evidently, they had something going on here, which I did not know even when I went there, and I found out later on that, what was going on. But at any rate but my grandmother's role, she likes to sing, but she had her own way of doing things and making change outside of organized movement. That's what this thing means when say the movement made us. There was always there was a movement long before we came on the scene. When I say we, I'm talking about the young people, Snake Corps, and the people in the organizations. And so my grandmother sort of demonstrated that. And so in their own way that they organized and did things for the community and for each other. And it had to do with family. In the Black community, it was strong family relationships. It's not what we think and we read in history books, everything else is that was one of the problems is you had a weak family structure. That is not true. Black people have a very strong family thing. It's called extended family. It might not have the biological parents around, all the time is. But you remember is that when the enslaved people were brought into this country, the first thing they did was separate the families. That was a system, part of the system to keep us separated and keep the family, especially Black males, out of the homes and stuff. So we had the extended family. So when I grew up, when I was on the farm, when I came back to Shreveport, I had a whole lot of fathers. Mr. Jack and them were down there. If I did something wrong, they would Miss Mamie and them, the women. They would chastise you. By the time I get home, I get it the second time. And that's because the fact is we were children of the community. No child went hungry. Adults went hungry before the children went hungry. And so they all looked out for the children, so a child got into trouble. They were out trying to figure out how to help this child, not condemn the child pieces. So that was the strength pieces. And so my grandmother came up with this thing. So a big thing when I never understood it until much later, but I watched her organize a community around getting sewage. Because when we got into Shreveport, an area that we lived in, there was no sewage. I mean, we had electricity and stuff, but no sewage. So you had outhouses. So she went downtown and got a piece and said, we put the sewage line down, but you're gonna have to dig your own ditch. So she organized the men and stuff like that, dig the ditch. The women would cook the food in the evenings, and they worked out after they got off of work. They would come and they would dig those ditches. I'll never forget that, watching them do that. Because the dirt road on the side. And so this time is when they finished there, they brought the inspector down. The inspector looked at it and said, oh, that's a beautiful ditch, but it's on the wrong side of the road. You got to do it all over again. So although what they put it was the lines that they had drawn, that the city had put down there, this is where the ditch should go. And so they decided they didn't want to do it this time. They gave up. They really didn't want to do it. My grandmother used to sit on had a rocking chair on the side of the road, that dirt road. And every evening when the men would get off work, she would sit there and she would sing. And she would sing gospel songs. And she would sing. And so people would laugh at her. The kids I played with, they laughed at her. And it's embarrassing to us because I was like, maybe my grandmother is going crazy. So one day, Mr. Jack came by. Mr. Jack said, Miss Bessie, if I really sit down and start to help you dig this ditch again, will you stop singing? So my grandmother said, sure, I'll do better than that. I'll cook you food, fix your dinner. And so Mr. Jack started. And then there came another man said, oh man, you doing this? Yeah, I think I'm wrong. So he went. And pretty soon the men went back to the ditch. The women had joined my grandmother and them, and they were fixing the food. And it became a family thing of getting the sewage down there as a team. And so that's how they got sewage in the area. So that was organized. That was sort of a different kind of demonstration, a piece of everything. And so watching this different thing, how the church is organized. When Emmett Till was killed, the men in the community where we grew up in got all the boys together and took us to a church and taught us and discussed with us is what to do and not to do when you're dealing with white folks. It really taught us about how to survive. So the death of Emmett Till became a teaching thing, not about violence and trying to get back. It was about, here's what you got to do to survive. This is what it's all like, kids, And so that too was a form of organizing in the neighborhood when we have this. So I didn't understand it at that time but as I grew older, I began to understand this piece of power. And my grandmother worked in white folks' kitchens. Before that, she worked in white folks' kitchens in terms of on the farm and plantation piece we did. So one thing she did understand, she understood white people. That was one thing she understood. And so there are pieces in the book that talks about her bravery and all talks of fear. Now, one thing about it too is about bravery. So my grandmother was very light skinned. With red hair. You couldn't tell her for being a white person, really, in a sense. And my grandfather was dark skinned. So they had this thing going on being together at times there were gazes on her. Who in the hell is he would know what they were. It was misunderstanding. But I never forget is that at that time my experience was going to school. You got on a bus, you had to sit in the back of the bus, and you and you come back the same thing as all the black kids. They had a little space in the back. And although the bus be empty in the front, you better not sit up there because you could be put in jail or beaten. All right. So my grandmother, I know that one day she was coming off of work. She got on the bus, and the front of the bus was pretty empty. And she got on, and my grandmother, for whatever reason, I don't think it was a Rosa Parks thing. I don't think it was that at all. She just sat right behind the bus driver. And I'm like, oh, Jesus, there she goes again, And so she then looks back and she sees me. And I'm like, oh, my God, what's going to happen? So my grandmother said, hey, Sonny, come on up here and sit with me. And I'm like, I am scared to death. I said, no, I wouldn't go. I refused. My grandmother called me 3 times. The last time I called her one more time. She said, come on. I didn't go. We rode to the end of the bus line, then we had to walk about 6 blocks and stuff through the white neighborhood to get to the black neighborhood. And so My grandmother was waiting on me on I got off that bus, and when I got off that bus, she cracked me side the head, bam. And I'm like, Mom, what's wrong? What, and she looks at me. She doesn't say about you have a right to sit up there. She says, don't you ever disobey me again. And I'm like, but we're not supposed. She said, don't you ever disobey me again. And that was a hard lesson there because I didn't put the pieces together. Is whatever's going on in the head was the right to sit there, but that wasn't the most important thing at that time. The most important thing is it's about family, and you don't disobey your elders, pieces. So so that's a very important. So there were a lot of things with my grandmother, my grandfather. I mean, that was just unbelievable for both on the plantation and life there is, that's covered in the book. But there's a different way that Black people dealt with, white racism at that time is that wasn't like, it was a different type of a protest, but it's all connected to like family. Like when my grandfather confronts his white guys because he used profanity in front of my grandmother and his grandson. And that turned him on to another different world where he'd risk it all at that moment. He says, don't you ever curse, he told the white man, in front of my wife and my grandchild. Yeah. So anyway.
Yeah, that was so many thoughts after that. David, one of the things that occurred to me is I think only in the last 4 or 5 years have I heard people talk about the PTSD that folks who were in the movement suffered, like just recently, maybe 6 or 7 years with some of the reunions. Folks are openly talking about it. When did you, as a son, as a family member, start to realize that your dad, his friends were dealing with PTSD, that was what was happening that you were seeing?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, that's sort of probably when I learned what PTSD was. I was like, that's why it makes sense. I think like I said, I think when I started reading the things they carried in this war story, and obviously there's a lot of PTSD in that story, and I was like, well, no, this makes a lot of sense. I know that Dad would have trouble sleeping at night if there was a soft noise in the house, or there were nightmares, and I'd also watch him go do speeches and things like that where these memories were coming back up. So the idea of PTSD has sort of always been there. I don't think I quite knew exactly how bad it was as until we were doing this book, of course. But this really started thinking, made me think a lot about the idea of this war and what this war meant, and who was in the war, and how do we treat the folks, these movement folks who survived and really won a war to create democracy in America, and that what they were up against. So yeah, so this PTSD thing has been with me for a lot, thinking about it, but also I've been thinking about the idea of like maybe like if PTSD is like the exact right thing, because like when you think about war and PTSD, you think about a PTSD that comes from a war being over, right? You go to war, you go to Vietnam, you come back, war's over, you're home. But what is it when those same terrors that were happening 60 years ago are still happening now? Dad is pretty much almost as likely to get stopped and killed in the street by a police officer as he was back then. So, and it's, I certainly am, and he's got grandchildren who certainly are. So the idea of the post is not really the most accurate way to describe it, because that terror is constant. There's a post based on his movement time, but there is a long-standing and unrelenting terror that continues every single day. So the question is, what exactly is post-traumatic, and the word post versus all the other stuff?
Mr. Dennis, one of the things we've never met, but I met your son, and then I began to learn about you, and I thought, why don't I know more about him? This seems odd. I've watched, Eyes on the Prize 27 times. I've read, numerous memoirs, but I didn't know. But some of that was explained in the book, because you didn't talk about a lot of things for a while because of survivor guilt. Can you talk about what that's been like and how you've come to terms with that?
Well, I don't think I really have. There were a number of years. I mean, really, 20 years or so, more, that I refused to do anything. I did a piece with the Eyes on the Prize because of Judith Richardson, who really talked to me about doing this, and I did it really because of her. And there are a few other pieces here and there because of people, friends. One with James Baldwin is because of my relationship with him and his brother. But other than that I just wouldn't do it for two reasons. One is it was very painful, I mean, I didn't understand it at the time, why it was so painful, But to talk about some of these things is, to talk about Medgar Evers, I can't get out of my head is, the last time I saw him, which was 1 hour before he was assassinated, it was a Cheney Goodman Swerner, 24 hours before they were assassinated. So all these people that, and I guess even more than that is what haunts you. A lot of us is, I think a lot of people don't admit it, but what haunts me about was that all of the people, the real heroes of the movement, and we try to, David did a good job of sort of saying in his book, were not the icons all the time. They played an important role, but they were able to do what they did because of all these other people on the ground. We brought in 1,000 students. So all the attentions around happens to be the students who came in and some of the icons who were in the leadership role that got them down here. But what about the people who housed them, fed them, and hid them back in those backwoods? And those kids, when they left, the press left and everything else, whatever happened to those people? And so that doesn't go away. I mean, there's this thing in my head when we talk about in the book is one thing that haunts me all the time is what really brought that to life was this couple in Canton, two old people, came in a buggy and a mule, and try to register and vote. And the old man, he had his Sunday best on, what they wore, but people have to wear. And that was his overalls, clean and pressed, a white shirt and a tie, and an old straw hat. And the lady was on the bus there. I'm quite sure it was his wife. They had to be in their 70s, around that at least, or older. And so she had a long dress, cotton dress on, and a bonnet. And they got off that wagon, and he says to her, he looks at us and said, "Where can I go and vote for George Raymond?" George Raymond was a civil rights activist, COFO, who worked for COFO and CORE and SNCC, whoever he could deal with it. And he was just there. So as we said, that George is not running for anything. It's this way you come to register to vote. And he looked at it and said, if I do that, can I vote for George Raymond? So he said, yeah, and explained to him some more. He goes up in this old lady to the top of the stairs to the courthouse areas to go register to vote. And they walk by people like Billy Noble, sheriff's people, chief of police, all these white people were on that plate waiting for them and were looking at them. And I knew that they had faced these people over and over again. But this day was a special face. You could see it in their eyes. Went up there and they came back down just as proud as they could be. He got her into the wagon. He looked at us, tipped his hat and said, "Thank you, sir." And he turned the mule around and they took off down there. And the last thing I remember is they're going away. And it's never stopped me in my head is because I could see the white guys up there. It's almost like, we get you, so you can see it, you can feel it. And I don't know whatever happened to them. I don't even know what their names were, you know. And so that gets me in terms of when we had those demonstrations and Black people make that stand. I mean, that was radical, revolutionary for them to do that. That took the courage that I don't think any of us had that much courage, because they knew what it was all about, is that they went back to those homes back in those backwoods. They got to face these people every day. Even when we didn't have to, we left or whatever happened there. But what happened to all these people, what they went through and everything. And so to me is that those are the real heroes of the movement, on whose backs is that we owe everything to, you know, and they do not get the recognition, because if we even knew who they were, can you imagine what it would be like for their children and their relatives to say, my aunt, my uncle, my cousin, they played a vital role in the civil rights movement also. So that's how you give birth to new leaders and stuff like this. It wasn't just a few people, you know, who made this movement. You know, the movement made us, because the fact is it was made by the people in these areas in Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, who really had to really face the real dangers that we have. I mean, almost 40 homes and churches were bombed in Mississippi during this period, one short period of time, you know. And we counted in terms of my count in my head as the people I knew during that period of time of 62 through 65. I counted 19. A lot of people count 5 or 6 or 7. I count 19.
Mr. Dennis, that reminds me of and David in the book of the scenes of the story of you going to Neshoba County, which, as you guys know, I'm from, with to Mount Zion there with James Chaney and the Schwerners, right? And
Okay.
right, and right, and even, you know, the scenes. I just want you to talk a little bit more about James Chaney, which I think most people watching will know was from Meridian, was a you know, a very brave civil rights worker who was from Mississippi, who was working with people from other places. But talk a little bit about you know, your friendship, or what you remember about him.
Yeah, James Chaney was introduced into the movement with us, as he's part of the young people in Hattiesburg. He was actually recruited into with us by George Raymond and Mateo Suarez, better known as Fluky. So that was long before he was working in that area before Mickey Swerner and Rita Swerner arrived in Mississippi. I think they came in January of 1964, and Mickey had been working with them all the way back in early 1963 as a field worker with the coast. So he worked between Meridian and also in the Canton area and in the 4th Congressional District of that piece. So that's one thing I want to straighten out, is because it makes it seem that he got brought into the movement by Mickey Swerner and them is when they got there in January. So, you know, he had been a part of this. In fact, he was the one who was really guiding them. He was a very smart, very brave young guy. And he's sort of part of that young people's group. You know, they have like Eve Esther, Marvin Wilson, Gene Young, better known as Jughead, that Dave was talking about earlier. These were young kids, you know, anywhere from 14 years of age to 17, 18 years of age. So my memory about James Chaney, I mean, he was just brave, and I didn't think that he had fear, if anything is. I think all of us were afraid, but he had this special quality of him whereby he could face it and dealt with it. Very well respected in the area, and he actually was the one who was the guidance to around this whole piece of moving into Neshoba County. So that's what I remember about him. And some things I didn't know. For instance, I did not know that he had a child until later. In fact, Donna, you were part of this, and I'm finding that out. I think y'all were doing a special around Angela.
That's right. There was this Glamour magazine article. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Both of you were at Mount Zion. For part
yeah. Right. Exactly. So I was, I did not know up until then. I think you were the one who contacted me. I think it was that she wanted to know more about her father.
That's right.
Yeah, and that's how I got to know that she was. I was back in Jackson working with the Algebra Project. Yeah.
Yeah, that was a pretty powerful day. And
yeah,
and for me, what was the most powerful thing about doing this was listening to all of you talk to each other. You know, that because you hadn't known her, because I guess she had been hidden, Angela, because out of fear. I mean, we can all understand that because she was just a baby when he was murdered.
right.
Yeah, that was right. Kimberly, do you want to?
I think my last question is for David. What advice would you give to other children of people with stories to tell that are hard stories? One of the fears I think you have with family members is you don't want to re-traumatize people. You're scared to ask the questions. What advice would you give to helping our people put these stories on paper, on video, record it in some way?
I would just say start the conversation. You know, I think one of the things that is a barrier for folks, I mean, the trauma is obviously a barrier, but I think one of the big issues is that people just don't see what they did as movement work. You know, they were just doing what they did, you know. Like my, dad tells a story of my, great grandmother in the sewage industry. That's just what she did, you know. And sometimes people feel as though what they did was insignificant, but just ask them, you know, what were things like back then, you know? What did you do? Did you do anything? Did you, what was your daily life? And I think those stories will just come naturally. And, I think, for me, obviously, in order to recreate these moments and do this, I had to ask Dad a lot of very tough questions and push and at times when it wasn't, when he didn't necessarily want to. And so that, you don't have to do what I did, like you don't have to go that far. But I think it's just good to know and to start the conversation, because I think that will empower folks to understand that, yeah, this goes in my family, this runs in my family. This is what my family did, and I could do something, and you don't have to be Martin Luther King or Fannie Lou Hamer or Medgar Evers or Rosa Parks and all these folks. You can just do something. Everybody does something, will be fine. So I think just starting that conversation will get the ball rolling. I think, out of this, Dad was, had more conversations with his grandkids, and they, and that became a very sort of empowering thing. And I think that's the type of stuff that we can do. Just start the conversation. And I think it can go both ways. I think, our elders could also start the conversations also. I mean, like, we don't know what questions to ask sometimes because we don't know where to start. So there maybe just, just sitting around and talking about it, I think it is a worthwhile thing to do.
Yeah, I'm going to add one piece about this is there is some people know about it, and maybe I think young people are not taking advantage of it. Go check out that old family Bible. For some reason, our ancestors, what they did was the Bible was a treasure. And it was a safe thing too, I think is. They wrote a lot of stuff. You could find the births of the dates of the children, relatives and who they were, and then certain passages of the Bible had meaning to them. So they're right in the margin, little pieces and stuff of stories. And you find I was a few weeks ago, but I'm sorry, last week it was a few weeks ago. I was in New Orleans with a friend of mine, Don Hubbard, and we had this conversation. He said, "Let me show you something." So he went and found his parents' Bible, and then, which he had to do, sent to somebody to treat, I guess it is, and what do you want to call it, and the whole page is all right, and got it done. And then all these notes in the margin. He said, "I learned so much about my family that they never talked to me about when I found this Bible and went through it, And the same thing with me too. I have, I have 3 of them from my mom, that she has from her parents and my grandparents. So that's a start. And the other place is, we have these church meetings. Churches can be a good place to get the men to start raising that question. So why not have discussion groups where people have written, sit and tell stories, about their families and stuff, and share it with the kids, the young people, because it's important. It's going to be tough. No one could have written this book but Davy, because I trusted him, And so to tell the story is not something easy. This thing has been, it's still painful in terms of what you have to go. I forgot so much, but trying to recapture it and everything else is a very painful process. I couldn't have done it with anybody else but him, So that might be where, so to do this, families are going to have some help and support in sharing these stories. And so maybe what that is us as a family, a community, can help do this if we share stories. Because talking to Don and my share of my family is that we had so much in common and didn't know it. So that commonality there can be a support to help us to be able to share the stories. Because as long as we allow the enemy to tell our story, we're not going to look too good. Right?
Well, that's the quote of the night, I think, among several of them. And I have to say to y'all, I just love that this kind of ended up with writing and reporting advice, because one of the things, a lot of writers in the room, but one of the things that I always tell my writing students and the people I talk to about writing is turn on a tape recorder and have those conversations with your family members and your elders. And a lot of people want to have conversations. And I'm not talking about just these particular conversations, these traumatic conversations, but just get those stories, because a lot of us regret when we don't, when we lose those stories. So that's an amazing way, I think, to end this conversation.
Can I just say one thing for you, for just 1 second? Mm-hmm. David touched on something that we came up with during the pandemic, so families are all over the places and we couldn't get in contact. So what we started doing was every Sunday we Zoomed, all right? But it wasn't just about saying hi, whatever. We talked. And then the grandchildren decided that they wanted more of a conversation. So they wanted to have their own time with me. And so on Saturdays, we started doing that with them. So it reminded me, like in the day, is that I remember that when I was growing up, my grandparents, we had conversations at the table. You know why? We didn't have that ignorant box on all the time. So there was no TV, And so one of the things is we did during this pandemic piece of the discussion, you couldn't deal with no cell phones. We just sat and talked to each other, although it was Zooming. So we need to figure out how to get rid of the distractions. We don't have dinner together anymore as families to really sit and talk about things. That should be at least once a week or Sundays, whatever it is, that the families come together, put those ignorant boxes in a tub or someplace else and shove them away, put them away, and really have an hour or two of a family dinner and a conversation. How are you? How was your day? And just sharing things with each other. So that's one of the things of getting to this issue around how do we have to begin to share with each other as family, and figure that out and get rid of these distractions. I'm sorry, I just wanted to say that.
No, it's perfect. And that's advice I think we all need in these kind of crazy lives. So thank you so much. And, Mr. Dennis, thank you for your service to the state and to this nation. We all appreciate everything that you did for us. I know you went through a lot. So thank you so, so much. And David, thank you so much for writing this book, because it really is. I'm gonna say it again. This is a really good book, folks, and it reads so well. I mean, David is just a wonderful writer and a wonderful storyteller. And, you know, we only touched on just a snippet of the stories that are in this book. So pick up this book. You know, there's a nice hardcover out there. These are the press copies. So please pick up a copy of this book and share it, buy it for people, because this is history that we all need. And we need to know this history intimately. Thank you to everybody out there for joining us tonight. Please share this widely. You know, you can watch it later on YouTube and Facebook. So please share it around. Also, I think we're off next week, and so we're going to have some great shows coming up in June. So watch our social channels and your newsletters for that. Also, please remember that as nonprofit media, we are in our spring giving campaign now. I'd get in trouble with Kimberly if I didn't bring this up. We are, you know, we value every donation. And if you want to join our MFP VIP Club and for a lot of wonderful member conversations, please, you can just go to mfp.ms/join, which is on the screen, and you can get all of that content as well as my writing conversations. My 5th one is coming up on Tuesday. But if you join, you can get all of this content that is on that website as well. So do what you can. Thank you for what you do. We appreciate all of you, and we will see you guys very soon. And gentlemen, thank you again for being here. We really
thank you for having us.
We as Mississippians, we are so proud of you both. So thank you for what you do.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See y'all soon.
All right. Bye-bye.